He's the genius mechanic that literally rewrote the NASCAR rulebook and ushered in changes that stand to this day. Smokey Yunick. Henry Yunick was born in Pennsylvania. His parents were from Ukraine, and they ran a farm. He used to go to school, but he ended up working on that farm to help his parents out. And while he was on that farm, he began tinkering with some motorcycles, and even built a tractor out of a wrecked car. That's quite impressive. Building an entire tractor out of a wreck of a car earned him the nickname Smokey. But World War II was on the horizon, and in 1941 he joined the USAF to fly B-17 bombers in both Europe and the Pacific. And when the war ended, he moved to Daytona Beach in Florida because it looked nice from the sky. And quickly he set up a shop called, and I'm not making this up, Smokey's Best Damn Garage in Town. That was the actual name of his garage. Turned out, pretty accurate name, because a local stock car team owner named Marshall Teague hired Yunick as an engineer once he saw his handiwork from his garage. And indeed it would be Smokey who prepared Herb Thomas's Hudson Hornet, which would race and then win the 1951 Southern 500 in NASCAR. Pretty impressive. And this success led to Smokey branching out across motorsport as he became more and more known in the community. He started racing teams for Chevy, Pontiac, and Ford, and helped develop Chevy's small block engines along the way. In fact, he built a Camaro in 1968 that set several Bonneville Speed Class records, and raced in Trans Am, just to name a few. Now, the Camaro was not exactly stock. The body was wide and the stance was sloped downwards. The angle of the windshield was reduced for less drag, and the glass was thinner to reduce weight, and in fact he was so devoted to weight saving he dipped the entire body in acid, which made the metal so fragile that if you leaned on it, it would bend out of shape. That is going to give you a key as to what type of engineer and mechanic Smokey was, because that's just the start. But in the meantime, he also competed in the Indy 500. For instance, in 1959, he created the reverse torque special, with an interesting philosophy at hand. You see, most engines have the piston rotate counterclockwise to the flywheel. However, this put more weight on the front right wheel, which, considering the front right wheel takes most of the brunt around oval tracks, could be a problem. So, he ordered a custom-built Offenheiser 4-cylinder that rotated clockwise the other direction. Now, that causes all sorts of problems with the gearing and the teeth because they're designed to go one way and not the other, so Smokey and his team rebuilt every single component in the drivetrain to fit the unique engine. Yeah, it was a radical design that actually worked better than you would expect, finished 7th overall, but it wasn't as game-changing as Smokey would have liked, and he proceeded to win next year's Indy 500 with a normal counterclockwise engine. But the fact that he even thought of that idea, it's freaking nuts. And he even built an even crazier car called the Hearst Floor Shifter Special, with another interesting philosophy under its helm. It was designed to improve weight distribution on the banking, so the driver would sit not in the center, as most Indy cars, he would sit on the left side, almost like a normal car. However, the engine, the fuel tank, everything would be right smack dab in the center. It didn't work, but the thing looks nuts. And it just went to show how outside the box Smokey was. But there is one innovation that did actually sort of work for him. And that was Jim Rathman's Watson Special Roadster, which had a revolutionary wing mounted on the roof. It was a bit rudimentary in the aerodynamic department. It was literally an upside-down plane wing, plain and simple. But the wing drastically increased downforce and allowed the Watson to decimate all in the cornering department at Indy that year. On the downside, it created so much downforce and therefore so much drag that it had no straight line speed at all, and it was actually slower around Indy than its contemporaries. But it would sow seeds for the future, and now every racing series on Earth has wings. And he was a pioneer of that at the Indy circuit. But let's be honest, we're all here because his NASCAR career. He was far more famous at that. Starting back in 1961, his Pontiacs won back-to-back Daytona 500s that year and the year after, a first in stock car racing. And it also won him 2 championships outright by 1951 and 1953. By the time of his retirement from NASCAR in 1970, his cars had won 57 races. That's pretty good for 19 years. Why? Because he mastered the unwritten rule of, if you're not cheating, you're losing. Of course, Smokey would say he wasn't cheating, he was just maximizing the rule book. You see, there's a direct quote from him saying, "They were cheating 10 times worse than us, we were just doing defense." And to be honest, most of this stuff wasn't even cheating. It was just finding the gray areas of the rulebook. He would scan the rulebook, and then say, oh, well, there's no rule about this, and then exploit that. So it's not really cheating. I mean, he did normal stuff like NOS and acid-dipped panels, but that was the tip of the iceberg for his creative genius when it comes to rule bending. He would intentionally design a fuel tank that was too large for regulations. Then he would put a basketball inside it and inflate it. Then the stewards would come in, check the car out, put the mandatory amount of 26 gallons, whatever it was, in the tank, certify it. Then Smokey would simply deflate the ball, take it out, and he has a bigger gas tank that's been certified. There were other things as well. In one race, he covered the rear wheels with a nice, smooth, drag-reducing metal plate. Basically flushed it with the rest of the body, sort of like those Le Mans racers you saw in the 80s and 90s. Then the drivers pointed out that he can't change tires with that. But Smokey didn't care, because once he put the car on pole, he simply cut those sections off the car with a saw. No rules against it. There are no rules saying when you can cut the inserts off. And then there was the rules regarding weight bias. You see, the car had to be based on the road car, which meant the engine had to be in the same place, and other various bits had to be in the same place as well. But there was nothing about the frame. So he lengthened and thickened the A-frame, and he did the exact opposite to the B-frame. So the right side was much thinner and much lighter than the left side, which meant the weight and center of gravity of the car shifted with the banking, therefore giving it better grip. That's freaking genius. But for the true mastery of masteries, his magnum opus, you have to talk about the 7/8 Scale Chevelle, the one you've all been waiting for. Let's be honest, this car is more myth than legend now. Smokey's told so many stories about this car, and there have been so many rumors that it's hard to keep track, so let's just get one right out of the way. Was the Chevelle actually 7/8 scale? Did he shrink the entire car down? No. They actually measured it. The car has pretty much the same dimensions, width, length. The only difference was the ride height, which was dropped by 2 inches. No, the car was not 7/8 scale, but it's the details that matter on this thing. First, the panel gaps were closed so tight that if you opened the doors, the paint would rub off. Then the front bumper was widened, smoothed out, and enlarged, creating an air dam. He built an air dam out of the front bumper. The floor was raised into the undercarriage to create a flat floor, because technically you're not allowed to have a flat floor. But, using a little bit of rule work and tweaking it about, he made, essentially, a flat floor. Not quite, but flush. Again, reducing drag. Then the massive 427 V8 was actually used as chassis reinforcement for better stiffness. And if that wasn't enough, the entire body of the car was shifted 2 inches forward on the chassis. Yes, he shifted the entire body forward on the chassis of the car, because there was no rule saying where the body had to be on the chassis. Like anyone would ever think otherwise, apparently. There was also no rule about where the interior had to be. So he moved the entire interior left, to the point where the driver's shoulder was actually touching the door. Again, this is all in the sake of center of gravity. If you have your center of gravity on the left side of the car, when you hit the banking, it's going to be more level. It's going to be faster, going to have more grip. And one last thing, and my personal favorite thing about this entire car, of majestic wonder. He noticed that there were no rules governing the fuel line. After his exploits with the basketball and the fuel tank, they made sure to regulate the fuel tank very harshly. But he didn't say anything about the fuel line. Now, most fuel lines are about an inch, maybe half an inch in diameter, a few inches long, normal. His fuel line was 2 inches in diameter and 11 feet long. Which meant that the fuel line itself could hold 5 gallons of fuel. It was a fifth of a fuel tank with just the line alone. The thing decimated all comers at the Daytona 500 practice session. It was so fast that the officials were a little bit skeptical, especially given that it was a Yunick car. Sure enough, they found 10 things they needed to fix before the race started, and of those they included chassis position, interior position, the flat floor, the engine reinforcements, the bumper, and various other things, and they gave him a whopping 1.5 hours to fix it all. Realizing that that was quite frankly impossible, he huffed, puffed, said some words that we can't say here, started his car up, shouted at the officials, "Make it 11," and drove off, while the officials were still holding his fuel tank. Yeah. The 7/8 Scale Chevelle might very well be one of the most famous NASCARs of all time, which is ironic considering it never actually did a race. But it was so inventive, it really was everything about Yunick embodied into a single machine. So why did he retire? Well, his good friend and driver Fireball Roberts died in a hospital 40 days after a fiery accident. And after that, Yunick decided to tackle safety head-on. In fact, he would patent the world's first safer barrier out of tires and plywood. We use those on every racetrack in the world, barring Isles of Man, today. But back in 1965, that was witchcraft. And NASCAR just didn't care. He just, no matter what he tried, he could never get any of his new safety regulations passed. And after years and years of frustration, he finally left in disdain in 1970. Now, of course, he's a mechanic, he's an inventor. he didn't stop messing about after he retired. Even after he retired from IndyCar racing, he didn't give up. He developed quite possibly the craziest engine ever made, the hot vapor cycle engine. It was initially said to be theoretical. He published a paper about it in a magazine, and people said, that's a very cool idea, if it could work. And he took that as a challenge. It was a 2-cylinder engine that ran on vapor alone. No liquid fuel at all, just vapors to try and increase fuel economy. It made 150 horsepower and could get over 60 mpg with a 2-cylinder that didn't even run on normal gasoline. It ran on gasoline vapor. And it had 150 horsepower and got over 60 mpg. I don't even know how that's possible, and I would call it shenanigans. However, not only did he put the engine in a car, a Pontiac Fiero, he drove it to the EPA to try and show them how useful it was, and of course they blew him off. But the fact of the matter is, he built a working gas vapor engine, drove it to the EPA, and now it's in a museum. It's insane. It was never really deemed viable to work on a production scale. It was really just a proof of concept of, hey, you said I couldn't do it, well now I did it, so suck it. That's really what that car was, but it's still an incredible achievement. And Yunick as a person was also recognized for his incredible achievements. He's been nominated to dozens of Hall of Fames around the nation, including the International Motorsport Hall of Fame in 1990. Ironically, the Hall of Fame he may never get into is the NASCAR Hall of Fame, despite his legacy of rule bending and how he literally wrote about half the rules in the current NASCAR rulebook. But he may never get into it for political reasons. One of the reasons he left, apart from the safety concerns, was his bitter rivalry with NASCAR officials. Probably because they kept disqualifying all of his cars and didn't listen to any of his safety advice. Apparently it got so bad he actually threw a wrench at a leading NASCAR official. And when you throw a wrench at someone, they're not inclined to put you in their Hall of Fame. Regardless, Yunick is an absolute legend in the automotive industry, despite the fact he only did one race as a driver. His mechanic skill and his creativity and unique bending of the rules is something that we may never see repeated in this ultra-strict modern environment. Given that ultra-strict modern environment, we need someone like Smokey now more than ever.